The laughter was the worst part. Not the cold metal folding chair that dug into her spine. Not the way her Aunt Gloria kept dabbing fake tears with a tissue she'd never once used. Not even the sight of her cousins in their pressed suits and silk blouses, already calculating square footage in their heads before the lawyer had finished his second sentence. The laughter. It happened when the lawyer, a thin, tired man named Mr. Osei, who clearly wanted to be anywhere else, slid a small white envelope across the mahogany table and said, quietly, carefully, to my granddaughter Miriam, I leave the sum of $2. And everything she needs to find her way. $2. The room didn't explode. It rippled. First a snort from Cousin Derek. Then Gloria pressed her lips together in that particular way that meant she was suppressing a smile. Then Derek's wife leaned over and whispered something to the person beside her, and within seconds, the entire room, 11 people who had barely spoken to Miriam in 3 years, was performing the polite version of mockery. Pressed smiles. Sideways glances. A barely contained chuckle from the back. Miriam sat very still. She picked up the envelope. Felt the 2 crisp dollar bills inside. Folded it in half. Placed it in the pocket of her second-hand blazer. And she said nothing. Because that was the thing about Miriam Asandi, she had been saying nothing her entire life while the world laughed. She was tired of it. But she wasn't broken. Not yet. 3 days before the reading of her grandmother's will, Miriam had been standing in a 7-Eleven parking lot in Savannah, Georgia at 11:43 p.m. counting quarters from a Ziploc bag to afford a bottle of water and a granola bar. She'd been living in her car for 6 weeks. Not a nice car, a 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard, a heating system that worked only on Tuesdays, and a back seat that smelled faintly of the lavender air freshener she'd bought in better times. She kept a folded blanket in the trunk, a battery-powered lantern on the passenger seat, and a small plastic bin with everything she needed to maintain the illusion that she was fine. Dry shampoo. An ironed blouse. A toothbrush she kept in a cup holder like it was perfectly normal. Miriam was 31 years old. She had a degree in landscape architecture from the University of Georgia. She had 7 years of experience. She had a portfolio that once made a senior partner at a firm in Atlanta say, "You have a gift for understanding how spaces breathe." And she had $14.73 in her bank account. A repossession notice for the apartment she no longer lived in. And a student loan debt that had grown so large it now felt less like a number and more like a weather system that followed her everywhere. The collapse had started small, the way most collapses do. She'd left her last firm after a supervisor took credit for a major project she'd designed, a coastal park restoration in Brunswick that made the local news. When she reported it internally, she was thanked for her input and quietly reassigned. When she pushed harder, she was let go. Restructuring, they'd called it. Her severance was 8 weeks of pay. She'd stretched it to 14 weeks through discipline and denial. Then her car insurance lapsed. Then her phone got cut off. Then her landlord, a man with no warmth and excellent paperwork, proceeded through the eviction process with surgical efficiency. She'd called her mother. Her mother had problems of her own, a new husband, a new start, a new life that didn't have room for a daughter who reminded her of everything she'd left behind. She'd called her father. He didn't pick up. She had friends. Or she'd had friends. The kind that are present in the good years and become gradually unavailable when things get complicated. She didn't blame them. She'd seen herself do the same thing, once, to someone else. So when she received the letter about her grandmother's will, her grandmother Adwoa, who she called Nana Adwoa, who had moved to the coast of South Carolina decades ago and who Miriam had not been able to visit in 2 years because she couldn't afford the gas, she felt something complex and painful. Guilt, mostly. Grief underneath it. And buried beneath both of those, something that frightened her because she knew it was there, hope. Nana Adwoa had always believed in Miriam. You see things others walk past, she used to say. That's not nothing. That's everything. Miriam drove to Beaufort, South Carolina in 5 hours with a thermos of black coffee and a half-tank of gas. She slept in the parking lot of a Cracker Barrel the night before. She ironed her blazer on the back seat using a travel iron she'd bought at a thrift store. She walked into the reading of her grandmother's will looking like someone who had a home to return to. And then came the envelope. And then came the laughter. The meeting broke up within an hour. The house in Atlanta went to Gloria. The savings, a modest but meaningful $47,000, were divided between 3 of Miriam's aunts and uncles. The antique furniture, the jewelry, the car. Each item accounted for, each item assigned. Miriam walked out with $2 and her grief. She sat in her Civic in the parking lot of the law office, hands on the wheel, engine off. She didn't cry. She was past crying, or rather, she'd stored all her tears in some internal reservoir that had quietly sealed itself months ago. She was about to start the engine when she heard a knock on the passenger window. It was Mr. Osei. The lawyer. He was wearing his coat now, briefcase in hand, and he looked like a man who had something to say but wasn't sure he should say it. She rolled down the window. "Miss Asante," he said. He had a careful voice. Deliberate. Like someone choosing each word the way you'd choose a step on an icy sidewalk. "Your grandmother asked me to give you something privately. After the reading." She was very specific about the order of things. He reached into his briefcase and produced a small brass key on a worn leather cord. The kind of key that looked old enough to remember things. He placed it on the passenger seat. Then he placed a sealed envelope beside it. Handwritten on the front, in her grandmother's slanted cursive, "For Miriam. Open alone." And then he placed a folded document. A property deed. Miriam looked at it. Then looked at him. "She left you the Pelican House," Mr. Osei said simply. "On Coosaw Island. It's been in a trust for 11 years, managed privately. Your cousins don't know about it because it was never part of the primary estate. It was registered separately. Legally airtight." He paused. "I recommend you read the letter before you look at the deed." He said good evening and walked back to his car. Miriam sat very still for a long time. Then she opened the letter. Her grandmother's handwriting was slanted and unhurried, the handwriting of someone who had never let urgency decide the shape of their words. "Miriam. You are reading this, which means the others took what they came for, and you sat there quietly and let them. I know you. I know what that costs a person. The Pelican House has been waiting. I bought it 40 years ago with money I saved for 30. I never told anyone because some things, kept private, stay true. It needs work. A lot of work. It is not a gift of comfort. It is a gift of purpose, which I think is what you actually need. You are a woman who understands how spaces breathe. I heard someone say that about you once, and I wrote it down. The key opens the front door. The deed is yours. The rest is yours to figure out. I love you without condition. I have always loved you most." Nana Adwoa. Miriam read it twice. 3 times. Then she pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes. Outside, the South Carolina evening was cooling into something soft. Spanish moss moved in the wind like slow breath. The parking lot was empty. The laughter from an hour ago had dissolved into the ordinary sounds of a town moving through its evening. She started her car. She drove to Coosaw Island. The Pelican House nearly broke her spirit in the first week. She'd imagined, on the drive over, something worn but standing. Weathered but dignified. She'd imagined herself walking in and feeling, for the first time in years, like she'd arrived somewhere. What she found was a 3-story coastal house that had been slowly losing an argument with the Atlantic humidity for over a decade. The porch boards were soft with rot in 3 places. 2 windows on the second floor were cracked, and the screens were long gone. The back deck had partially collapsed, not dramatically, but with the quiet resignation of something that had simply given up. Inside, there was a smell, salt and old wood and the specific mustiness of rooms that haven't breathed in too long. But it was standing. And it was hers. She had no money to hire anyone. She had no tools. She had a car, $2, a laptop with a cracked screen, a name she didn't want to use, and whatever was left of her professional knowledge. She slept in the house that first night on a sleeping bag she'd unrolled on the one solid floor she could find, the kitchen. She stared at the ceiling in the dark and listened to the sound of the water nearby, the low conversation of the marsh at night, the frogs and insects negotiating some ancient agreement. In the morning, she drove to a hardware store in Beaufort. She had $17 left, the original $14 and the $2 from the envelope, plus $1 in coins from her cup holder. She bought a box of trash bags, a tape measure, a notepad, and a pencil. She drove back and spent the next 4 hours moving through every room with the discipline she'd been trained for, not as a grieving granddaughter, but as a professional. Cataloging damage. Measuring structure. Drawing rough sketches. She created a triage list. Things that were dangerous. Things that were urgent. Things that could wait. Things that were cosmetic. It was the first time in months she felt competent. Then the practical reality of zero money reasserted itself, and she sat down on the back steps and stared at the collapsed deck and thought, I cannot do this. The first breakthrough came from an unlikely place. Miriam created a free account on a platform for historic home restoration enthusiasts. She documented the Pelican House. Its age, built in 1921. Its architecture, a classic lowcountry style with high ceilings designed to channel coastal wind before air conditioning. Its bones, which her practiced I told her were surprisingly sound beneath all the cosmetic decay. She posted photos. Not polished photos, her cracked laptop meant her phone did the work, and the photos were imperfect, honest, sometimes beautiful by accident because the house, in its ruins, was still beautiful. People responded. A woman in Vermont who was an amateur architectural historian commented that the Pelican House appeared to have an original heart pine floor beneath the peeling linoleum. A man in Oregon who specialized in historic window restoration said the cracked windows could be repaired for a fraction of replacement cost if she could source the right glass. A retired contractor in Charleston, a man named Bill Garrett, commented simply, I'm 2 hours away and I have slow winters. Send me the structural report. She had no structural report. She had her hand-drawn sketches and her professional assessment. She sent Bill Garrett her sketches. He drove out the following Saturday. He was 63, compact and weathered, a man who looked at buildings the way doctors look at patients, with attention that wasn't sentimental but wasn't cold either. He walked the house for 90 minutes without saying much. Then he stood on the front porch and looked out at the marsh. Foundation solid, he said. Porch is fixable. The deck out back is a project, but it's not a catastrophe. He paused. Your grandmother owned this? Yes. She ever rent it? I don't know. I didn't know it existed until last week. Bill looked at her. Then at the house. Then back at her. I'll help you, he said. Materials cost only. I've been looking for something to do that matters. She almost cried. She didn't. Instead, they started the following Monday. The weeks that followed were among the most physically demanding of her life. She had no construction background, her work had always been on the design and planning side. Her hands blistered and healed and blistered again. She learned to pull rotted boards without compromising the ones beside them. She learned to sand and to seal and to measure twice before cutting. She learned that restoration was not about making something new, it was about revealing what had always been there. The heart pine floors were real. When she and Bill pulled back the linoleum in the main living room, the wood beneath was the deep amber of old honey, tight-grained and almost impossibly beautiful. She knelt on that floor and ran her hand across it and felt something shift in her chest. Money remained a crisis. She sold her laptop, the cracked one, and bought a second-hand one for $40 less at a pawn shop. She picked up small remote work, drafting services for small landscaping companies, paid through online platforms. Work that required 3 hours and paid barely enough to buy materials for the next project. She ate simply. She slept early. She worked every day that there was light. There were moments of despair that were real and physical, not dramatic, not cinematic, just the low specific weight of exhaustion and doubt. A morning in week 4 when she sat on the repaired porch in the gray early light and thought, very clearly, what if this is just another version of failing? What if I restore this house and it changes nothing? What if I'm just good at saving things that don't save back? She wrote those thoughts in her notebook. Not to solve them, to see them. To acknowledge they were real without letting them make decisions for her. She went inside and started working. It happened in month 3, on a Tuesday in November, when Miriam was pressure washing the exterior of the house and a woman stopped her car on the narrow island road and sat there watching. Miriam noticed her after a few minutes and turned off the washer. The woman got out. She was perhaps 60, elegantly dressed in the way of someone who had money but didn't need to prove it, understated, comfortable, purposeful. She introduced herself as Catherine Marsh. She said she lived on the island year-round and had been watching the Pelican House come back to life. It's been empty for 11 years, Catherine said. Most of us assumed it would be sold to developers eventually. It won't be, Miriam said simply. Catherine looked at the house. Then at Miriam. Then she did something unexpected. She asked about the design choices. The color Miriam had chosen for the exterior trim, a specific pale sage that she'd mixed herself to match an old photograph she'd found in one of her grandmother's albums. The way the porch columns had been reinforced but not replaced, preserving their slight imperfection. The plants Miriam was beginning to establish along the front path, native species, carefully chosen, low water, deep-rooted. Miriam answered each question with the precision and passion of someone who had been waiting to talk about this for months. Catherine listened. Completely. The way people rarely listen. Then she said, "My sister-in-law has a home on the northern end of the island. She bought it 2 years ago. She's been trying to find someone who understands low-country architecture to help with the grounds and exterior restoration. Would you be willing to meet her?" Miriam met her. The sister-in-law, a woman named Patricia, had a budget and a timeline and a very clear sense of what she didn't want, the generic coastal renovation look that was beginning to colonize the islands. Historic homes. What she wanted was someone who understood what the land had been, and could restore it without lying about its history. Miriam had spent her entire professional life studying exactly that. The contract Patricia offered was modest but transformative, enough to eliminate the materials debt, enough to pay for the professional restoration work she couldn't do herself, enough to breathe. She took it. She delivered it, on time, under budget, and beautifully. Patricia posted 3 photographs on a private social network for coastal property owners. Within 2 weeks, Miriam had 3 more inquiries. But the real turning point, the one that didn't come from money, happened one evening that same November. When Miriam was standing alone on the restored back deck watching the sun go down over the marsh. The deck she'd rebuilt board by board. The deck that had been a ruin the night she arrived. The water was going gold and copper. A heron stood motionless in the shallow grass near the bank. The sky was doing something extraordinary. The way evening skies on the water sometimes do, layers of color that seemed to suggest the atmosphere was doing this specifically for the people standing in it. Miriam thought of her grandmother. She thought of the letter. A gift of purpose, which I think is what you actually need. She had not understood that sentence when she first read it. She understood it now. The gift wasn't the house. The house was just the address. The gift was the confrontation, with herself, with what she was capable of, with the difference between comfort and aliveness. Nana Adwoa had given her exactly what she needed, in exactly the form that would force her to actually use it. She stood on that deck for a long time. She was not happy in the simple sense. She was something more complicated and more durable than happy. She was present. Fully, completely present in her own life for the first time in years. By the following spring, the Pelican House was finished. Not finished in the way of a renovation show, no dramatic reveal, no before and after photographs staged for effect. Finished in the way that a living thing is finished, complete in its current state, still subject to weather and time, but standing with integrity. Miriam had kept the heart pine floors. She'd restored the original transoms above the doors, those narrow windows designed to move air in an era before electricity that now moved air and light with quiet elegance. She'd rebuilt the wraparound porch wider than it had been, using historical photographs as her guide. She'd planted a garden along the eastern side that was wild in the right places and shaped in the right places, a garden that looked like it had always been there. Which was exactly what she'd intended. She'd painted the exterior a deep warm white with the pale sage trim. Against the coastal light and the dark of the marsh behind it, the house looked like something remembered from a dream. She did not sell it. She did not rent it as a vacation property, though several people offered to pay very well for both options. She lived in it. She also, by that spring, had a business. Small but real, restoration landscaping and exterior design for historic coastal properties. She had a name, Breathe Restoration. It came from what that senior partner had said years ago, the thing she'd never forgotten. She worked alone, sometimes with Bill, sometimes with a small rotating team of local craftspeople she'd met through the work. She'd learned things during those months that had rearranged her interior landscape. Discipline, yes, but everyone talks about discipline like it's simply willpower. What she'd actually learned was different. She'd learned that consistency isn't the same as force. That showing up every day isn't heroic, it's just a decision made so many times it becomes automatic. She'd learned that rest was not the opposite of work, it was part of the structure. She'd learned to ask for help. That one had been hard. Harder than any rotted board. She'd learned that humiliation, being laughed at in that room. Being handed an envelope with $2 while her cousins counted their inheritance, could either be a wound you protect forever or a source of clarity you choose to look at directly. She'd chosen to look at it. Not without pain. But clearly. There were consequences that were harder to process. Her relationship with her extended family did not warm. When word spread, as it eventually did, that Miriam had inherited a coastal property worth far more than the rest of the estate combined, the dynamic shifted into something uglier than laughter. There were comments. There were insinuations about whether her grandmother had been in her right mind. There was a conversation with a lawyer her Aunt Gloria had hired, which came to nothing because Mr. Osei had done his work carefully and Nana Adwoa had done hers. Miriam did not fight it with anger. She responded through the attorney. She was civil when required. She was not warm. She did not owe them warmth. What she grieved, privately, was the version of the family she'd wanted. The one where her grandmother's death became a reason to come together rather than divide. She grieved it honestly and then she let it go, the way you release something into a river, not without watching it go, but without chasing it. 8 months after the reading of the will, Miriam returned to Mr. Osei's office. She'd made an appointment specifically. She'd brought coffee. She wanted to understand something that had been sitting in her mind like a stone at the bottom of a clear pool, visible but uncollected. Why $2? Mr. Osei sat across from her with the relaxed posture of a man who'd been waiting for this particular question. "Your grandmother was very specific," he said. "She spent considerable time on the wording." He opened a folder. He'd kept notes. "She said, and I'm reading her exact words here, the $2 are not symbolic. They are literal. I want Miriam to have $2 and an envelope with my words before she has the key. Because I want her to know that she will feel what it is to have almost nothing. And I want her to choose to keep going anyway. The house will mean nothing to her if she doesn't feel that first." Miriam sat very still. "She staged it," Miriam said quietly. "She staged it, Mr. Osei confirmed. He almost smiled. She was a very deliberate woman. Nana Adwoa had known the family would laugh. She'd expected it. She'd designed the moment, the public humiliation, the $2, the private delivery of the key, as a kind of trial. Not cruel. Not theatrical for its own sake. But intentional in the way of someone who understood, deeply, that gifts received without effort tend to dissolve. She had wanted Miriam to feel, viscerally, what it was like to be given nothing in public, and then, alone, to discover something that no one could take. She'd wanted Miriam to understand that real inheritance isn't what's announced in a room full of people. Real inheritance is private. It's the thing passed between two people who actually saw each other. It's the thing that survives the laughter, the division, the lawyers and the folding chairs and the pressed suits. Miriam drove home to the island in silence. She sat on the front porch as the afternoon light moved across the marsh. She thought about inheritance, what we receive and what we carry and what we make. She thought about her grandmother, who had saved for 30 years to buy this piece of land, who had kept it secret because some things, kept private, stay true. Who had watched her granddaughter from a distance and understood her better than anyone who lived closer ever had. She reached into the pocket of her jacket. She'd kept the envelope. She still had the $2 inside. She held it for a moment. Then she put it back. There was a woman who understood how spaces breathe. There was a woman who had rebuilt a house from ruin with her own hands and the generosity of strangers. There was a woman who had been laughed at in a room and had said nothing, because she was done wasting words on people who weren't listening. And there was a grandmother who had known all of that was possible. Who had given her granddaughter not comfort, but the conditions for becoming herself. The marsh was doing its evening thing, that slow, complete transformation from daylight to dusk, the water changing color by degrees, the birds finding their rhythms. The world quieting in the specific way it quiets near water. Miriam sat in it. Completely in it. There's a version of this story that gets told at dinner parties. She inherited a coastal estate worth $750,000 and turned it into a successful business. Her cousins got the cash, she got the kingdom. People nod at that version. They enjoy it. It has a satisfying shape. But that version is missing the most important part. What Miriam received wasn't a house. What she received was a woman's faith in her, communicated backwards, in the shape of an absence. $2 and a key and a letter that said, "I believe you can figure out the rest." And what she built wasn't a business. What she built was herself. A version of herself that had been tested not by optimal conditions but by the hardest ones, no money, no help, no safety net. Nothing but the slow accumulation of one decision made correctly after another. The laughter in that room, the pressed smiles, the sideways glances, none of that had the power it seemed to have in the moment. Because humiliation only has permanent power if you agree with it. If you believe, somewhere in your bones, that the people laughing see something real. Miriam had sat in that cold chair and held an envelope with $2 and felt the room's amusement wash over her. And she had not agreed. That small, private act of disagreement, not defiance, not performance, just a quiet internal no, was the first brick of everything that came after. Here's what the last 8 months had taught her: your life will be shaped not by what you're given but by what you do with what you're left with. And sometimes, the people who love you most give you something that looks like nothing, because they trust you to turn nothing into enough. The Pelican House stood behind her as the stars came out over the lowcountry. Heart pine floors still holding. Porch columns still standing in their slight imperfection. Garden breathing along the eastern wall. The marsh at the back of the property doing what marshes do, absorbing the world's noise and returning it as something quieter. Miriam Asante was 31 years old, and she had stopped looking for someone to make room for her. She had built her own room. With $2. And everything she needed to find her way. And here's the question I want to leave you with today. If someone you love deeply left you nothing but a locked door and a handwritten note that said, "I believe you can figure out the rest," would they be right about you? What would you build? If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who's quietly carrying something heavy right now. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for someone in the middle of their struggle is simply let them know, we see them. We believe in what's coming.